With nearly 3 decades of fictional history to cover, there's a whole lot going on in the 28 Days Later universe, and none of it is pretty. From Patient Zero to the Bone Temple, this is the only timeline you need to understand the spread of the Rage virus. Just beware! Spoilers for all 4 movies in the series just ahead. 28 Days Later begins on the first day of the Rage virus outbreak, with a scientist trying to explain why he helped engineer a virus that turns its victims into man-eating monsters.
In order to cure, you must first understand.
Since the first film primarily focuses on Jim and his companions, we don't learn much about the lore underlying the universe in the films themselves outside of secondhand info. Luckily, the graphic novel 28 Days Later: The Aftermath gets into the nitty-gritty. The virus is the twisted love child of 2 deeply shady Cambridge scientists named Warren and Clive, who are attempting to develop a cure for rage in the world's most toxic work environment. Warren is extorting Clive over claims of spousal abuse, while Clive can't stop harassing his ex. When the scientists find themselves short on appropriate test subjects, Warren pays off a police captain to get his hands on a violent prisoner, which Clive disapproves of. Said prisoner reacts violently, forcing the scientists to kill him and cover it up. They keep powering forward, using the Ebola virus as a carrier for their rage inhibitor. After all, there are heavyweight financiers on board and paychecks to cash. Clive and Warren start testing their rage inhibitor on chimpanzees instead, pumping them full of it, hooking them to a bunch of sensors, and forcing them to watch violent imagery Clockwork Orange style. Surprising no one but them, this assault on the scientific method goes terribly awry. Not only does the trial not lead to a commune of peaceful apes, but within 2 weeks, the virus suddenly mutates into a full-blown rage virus that magnifies the anger hormones of its subjects profoundly.
It was the blood. Or something in the blood.
Their tense professional relationship already strained, Clive quits the project and heads home to call an eco-terrorist animal rights group before trying to end his own life out of guilt. Warren decides to own up to the project's failure, but it turns out the money guys are fine with exploring ways to monetize rage instead. Around the same time, a London bicycle courier named Jim gets hit by a car and ends up comatose in a hospital, where he remains for the first 28 days of the outbreak. Elsewhere, siblings Tammy and Andy Harris head to Spain for camp. Unfortunately for Warren, whatever plans his benefactors had to generate the big bucks by weaponizing the rage virus never come to fruition. As he hashes things out with the money guys, his lab is already under assault from Animal Freedom Front, the animal rights extremist group Clive tipped off about his experiment. As seen in the beginning of 28 Days Later, the crew wastes no time booking it to Cambridge Primate Research Center, breaking into the lab and expressing horror at the chimp's treatment. While exploring the facility, they encounter a scientist who warns them that the chimps are highly contagious, having been given an inhibitor for rage. Moved to tears at the sight of the chimps crammed into tiny glass cages, one activist releases an ape, which rushes to attack her. She shows signs of infection within seconds, and the situation descends into chaos. At this point, the story lines up with the comic, which depicts Warren stepping out of his office to get attacked by a chimp and become infected himself. Over the course of the day following the lab leak, the rage virus quickly spreads through Cambridge and London. The graphic novel shows just how quickly carriers of the virus are able to travel, as a family's birthday picnic is interrupted by a red-eyed chimpanzee with sensors still on his head. Liam, the youngest son, is attacked and loaded into an ambulance as the rage virus sweeps through the rest of the park. En route to a hospital in London behind the ambulance, the remaining family members observe humans attacking each other before catching up to the ambulance, where Liam has infected the paramedics and driver. Distraught at Liam's condition but having narrowly escaped with their own lives, the surviving and now quarantined family listens to the news over the next few days as London falls to the virus. They eventually try to escape London themselves, passing barricades and hordes of infected along the way. Thousands of families attempt to escape the outbreak during its first 2 weeks, to varying degrees of success. As Selena and her husband David are packing their things to flee London, their home is attacked, ultimately forcing her to impale her infected husband through the chest. While both planes and trains are still leaving around this time, the rush to evacuate is so intense that survivor Mark permanently loses touch with his family in the chaotic scene of a crowd crush. The two will be teaming up for survival before long. Elsewhere, Liam's siblings escape by jumping from a bridge as their parents are overcome by the infected. Jim's parents give up on escape altogether, leaving behind a note before going out on their own terms. Donald and Alice Harris, whose children are thankfully all the way over in Spain, take refuge in the English countryside with other survivors until they're rudely interrupted by a horde of the infected. As Alice tries to save a young boy, Don runs away and makes it to a boat, leaving Alice to fend for herself. Around 15 days into the outbreak, London's evacuation turns into a hard quarantine, with many Londoners trying to beg, bribe, and fight their way out. But NATO and the United Nations aren't having it. The military sets up at least one camp, which is where Dawn ends up. Left alone and presumed dead after her husband escaped, a confused and apparently immune Alice returns to her home in the evacuation zone. Unable to return back home to England, Alice and Don's children are rerouted to a refugee camp around 3 weeks into the outbreak. It's not clear how long it takes the infected to reach the Scottish Highlands, but when they do, little Jimmy Crystal and his young relatives have their Teletubbies viewing session rudely interrupted. He escapes to the local church, where his vicar father declares that Judgment Day has arrived.
So scared, Dad. I think Mum's just gonna be dead.
Oh no, son. Not dead. Saved.
Jimmy is given his father's cross, then watches in horror as his dad happily succumbs to rage. Having lost their effort to push back the outbreak, Major Henry West and his remaining officers take refuge in Worsley House, where they shortly adopt the collective dream of enslaving women to repopulate England. Finally, Jim wakes up and takes to the streets to find that he's the only one there. That is until he has his first encounter with some very unfriendly infected. The period of London's post-rage apocalyptic journey following Jim's awakening marks a period of hardship for the remaining survivors still trapped in the London metro area. With no supply chain, no fresh food, no healthcare, no police, or anything else they might need, small bands of survivors are forced to survive by scavenging and looting. As Jim is saved by Mark and Selena, survivor Hugh Baker observes that the infected use their sense of smell to locate their victims, which he exploits by dousing mannequins with perfume to lure them in and ambush them. Unlike most survivors, Hugh actually chose to remain behind through the evacuation so he could fight for his country. He ends up becoming one of the last remaining survivors in the London area before getting rescued and sent to a refugee camp where he meets Liam's siblings, Sid and Sophie, as well as Clive, who managed to stay alive after all. Until he's not. After Selena kills Mark upon his infection, she and Jim add the teenage Hannah to their traveling party. They make it out of London, navigate through the ruins of Manchester, and escape the vile soldiers of Worsley House, not to mention countless rage zombies. Having long since taken up residence in a remote English cottage, they work together to sew a massive fabric sign reading "Hello" to try and catch the attention of a survey jet flying over the area.
Do you think he saw us this time?
He did. After their rescue, the three companions receive international notoriety for their survival story, along with the news media nickname the Manchester Three. But as depicted in the later comic book series, the trio is not so well received by the British government. They place the orphaned Hannah in the foster care system, ship Selena off to Norway's Bergen refugee camp, and eventually prosecute Jim, sentencing him to death by firing squad for his role in the deaths of Major West's depraved platoon. Around the 11th week after the rage outbreak begins, NATO initiates Operation Rising Dawn, a full-scale operation to clean up, repatriate, and repopulate Great Britain, as depicted in 28 weeks later. Although the operation doesn't begin in earnest until around the 24th week post-outbreak, NATO forces under the direction of the United States military begin showing up weeks earlier. The operation begins by securing London's Isle of Dogs, the East London Peninsula alongside the Thames River. This initial safe zone called District 1 boasts a stable infrastructure that includes housing, medical care, utilities, and even a supermarket.
Although the Isle of Dogs is completely safe, the surrounding area of London is not.
Around week 18, England is declared completely free of the infected after it's discovered that they can still starve to death. Despite England's great strides with District 1 though, it's worth noting that the vast majority of Brits are still living in refugee camps. As NATO forces begin repatriating British citizens, Tammy and Andy Harris move in as the first miners in the district as Don is reunited with them and given a job. Don's joy at reuniting with his children is never fully realized, as he's silently tormented by the bitter truth that he abandoned their mother to be eaten by zombies. It's a calculated decision that would just be tragic and haunting if not for the fact that she managed to defy the odds and survive infection, making her the first known example of an asymptomatic carrier and potentially the savior of the human race.
She is incredibly valuable. Her blood could contain the key to a vaccine, even a cure.
But none of that really matters after Don, in all his shame and remorse, begs for her forgiveness and receives it along with a loving kiss. But asymptomatic carriers are still carriers, meaning that the moment she kisses him, he's infected. This immediately ignites a second wave of the outbreak, which rapidly spreads throughout the Isle of Dogs. Having already seen how fast the virus wiped out London the first time, and keen on not watching it spread even further, NATO forces immediately start massacring the citizens of District 1, mowing them down with their guns and eventually resorting to carpet bombing to contain the threat. Thousands of citizens are killed in the mayhem as US-led forces take out the people they were meant to protect and destroy all of the infrastructure that they've been working so hard to build.
Abandon selective targeting. Shoot everything. Targets are now free. We've lost control.
But as cruel as that may seem, it makes a tragic amount of sense when we're shown that the virus has already reached Paris at the end of 28 weeks later. Although the virus is pushed back and contained to England once more, the possibility of it spreading past the British Isles haunts the rest of the world. As weeks turn to years, the humans that weren't lucky enough to be evacuated have no choice but to try and rebuild civilization from the ground up. But how does one survive in such a hostile environment? One group of survivors on the eastern side of the UK establishes a small community on the island of Lindisfarne, which can only be reached by a causeway that disappears under the water during high tide. By the time 80 years have passed since the outbreak began, they have strong defenses, agriculture, and even an education system. They also have their own rituals and traditions, like the coming-of-age hunting trip that 12-year-old Spike embarks on with his father, Jamie.
Let's go get your first kill.
That said, not every survivor decides to participate in civil society. One man, former physician Dr. Ian Kelson, lives a solitary life not too far from Lindisfarne. About 15 years into the outbreak, he decides to devote the rest of his life to the construction of a grand ossuary, a monument to the dead made out of human skeletons. But despite his intimidating appearance and foreboding bone temple, Kelson is a reasonably easy guy to get along with. The same can't be said for Jimmy Crystal. We don't know exactly what happens to him in the first years of the apocalypse, but it can't be anything fun. Whatever it is, he copes by clinging to entertainment from the before times. He starts a cult of personality once he's grown up a bit, incorporating elements from his favorite television shows into the twisted new persona of Sir Lord Jimmy Crystal as he takes in young followers. Of course, it's not just human society that's changed. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, the infected have seemingly evolved as well. Not only have they figured out how to calm their rage enough to not starve to death, but they've also figured out how to reproduce without biting people. Some of them have even become so-called alphas, infected pack leaders that are even bigger, stronger, faster, and way harder to kill.
I've seen it take a dozen hits to drop one of those things.
As for the rest of the world, it's pretty much gone on as normal. There are smartphones, delivery apps, and all sorts of modern conveniences that survivors can barely conceive of. When Spike learns of Kelson's existence, he's desperate to have the doctor examine his ailing mother, Isla, who's suffering from a mysterious illness. The two sneak out of Lindisfarne to track him down, coming across a pregnant infected along the way. Isla helps her give birth to a baby that seems to be miraculously free of rage, and she and Spike take the baby along with them to meet Kelson. Kelson breaks the bad news to Spike that Isla is dying of cancer. She doesn't survive her time at the Bone Temple, leading a disillusioned Spike to leave the baby at Lindisfarne and go solo for a while. That's when he encounters Sir Jimmy Crystal and his followers, all of whom are also named Jimmy. At the start of 28 years later, the Bone Temple, Spike kills one of the Jimmies in self-defense and gets inducted into the group at the cost of his individuality.
What's your name?
Spike?
No, I think your name is Jimmy.
According to Sir Jimmy, he's the son of Old Nick, his fancy name for the devil. Not a very good sign for Spike, to say the least. Back by the Bone Temple, Dr. Kelson gets to work on his newest project, finding a cure for the rage virus. His tests on Samson, the local alpha, lead him to discover that the infected are still capable of understanding language when they're sedated. Samson is able to understand his own name, and before long, he's even speaking.
This is interesting.
Kelson comes to the conclusion that the virus causes psychosis in its victims, but luckily, psychosis is treatable with psychiatric intervention. Just when it seems like he's about to make a breakthrough, though, Sir Jimmy throws a wrench into his plans.
I'm in a bit of a bind. You're in a bit of a bind too.
After the Jimmies brutally torture and kill a group of survivors, one of them, Jimmy Inc., reveals that she saw Kelson, believing him to be Old Nick. When Sir Jimmy goes to introduce himself, he realizes that Kelson is just a mortal man, but in order to keep the Jimmies in line, he threatens to kill the good doctor if he refuses to pretend to be the devil. So Kelson makes himself look devilish, busts out his Iron Maiden record, and puts on the first heavy metal show that Britain has seen in 28 years.
Let's turn this up to 11.
When Kelson realizes that Spike is one of Sir Jimmy's followers, he changes tactics, telling the cult leader that if he's really the son of the devil, he'll allow himself to be crucified like Jesus. Instead, Sir Jimmy stabs Kelson, but Spike and Jimmy Inc. decide to follow Kelson's orders and nail Sir Jimmy to a cross, upside down like his necklace. Not only is this the end of the Jimmies, but it's the end of Dr. Kelson. But luckily, it's not the end of the hope for a cure. Samson displays a remarkable recovery, saying thank you to Kelson before carrying his corpse away. At this point, Spike and Jimmy Inc., whose real name is Kelly, are the only remaining Jimmies. They leave the Bone Temple in search of new beginnings. Sometime later, in a familiar cottage in the remote countryside, a teenage girl named Sam studies for a history test. Her tutor just so happens to be Jim, not Jimmy, but Jim, from the original 28 Days Later, who somehow avoided his death sentence. He's also her father, meaning that Selena is presumably her mother. The study session is interrupted by loud noises, so Jim and Sam grab their guns and go outside. They see two figures in the distance, Spike and Kelly, running from a pack of infected. The Bone Temple ends with Sam asking her dad if they should save the young survivors, to which Jim responds, "Of course we do." That's where the 28 Days Later timeline ends for now, but the fifth installment in the franchise will hopefully tie up all the loose ends. Is there a cure for the virus? What's going on with that baby? And what will happen now that the heroes of the past and present have finally united? Thankfully, we won't have to wait 28 years to find out.